Starting off with a little bit of review. We should finish up all this fungus stuff today and start talking a little bit about animals as the plan. Phylogenetic tree. Supposed to show what? How these things are related by genetics and evolution. Again, we've talked about the bottom part of this a lot. Fungi supposedly evolved as an ancestor of protists, and animals supposedly came from the same place, along with plants, all from Protista. Protists-like organisms. But with fungi today, we've already talked about their cellular characteristics. Most fungi, other than yeast, are multicellular. Every fungus is eukaryotic. Every fungus is heterotrophic. Fungi cannot do what? Somebody yesterday, when I was talking about photosynthesis, tried to tell me that some fungi can do photosynthesis. They can't. They all have cell walls made with chitin, which is a sugar. And during most of their life cycle, they're haploid. They only have one set of what? Chromosomes, not two, like us. They only become diploid for a short period during sexual reproduction. Now, we've talked about these terms here several times as well. We talked about a saprobe or saprophyte is a fungus that does what? Ethylene, a decomposer, a mineral recycler. That's their main job in the environment. Fungi are made out of these thread-like what's a good way of putting this? Thread-like strands of cells. They're called hyphae. And a bunch of those all wrapped together make up what's called the fungus body or the mycelium. Remember that anytime you see the letters M-Y-C-E or M-Y-C-O, you should be thinking fungus. M-Y-C-E, M-Y-C-O. Fungus, 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 fungus. A fruiting body is the reproductive organ. It makes what? What are the reproductive cells of a fungus? Spores. And then chitin, we said, is the sugar, the carbohydrate that makes up cell walls. And conidia are spores made how? Asexual. Okay. Most fungi reproduce both ways, sexually and asexually. We talked a little bit about the different groups and how they're grouped based on what? Reproductive structures. And notice that M-Y-C-E is in all the names. The basidiomycetes are like mushrooms. Their reproductive organs are called basidia, and that word means club, shaped like a club. And these are usually found right underneath the cap of a mushroom. Little club-shaped structures that contain spores. And we talked over and over again about this life cycle diagram. How that most of them have an asexual part of their life cycle. The mycelium does mitosis. Mitosis takes one cell and creates how many? Two. And those two are related how to the one it started from? Speak up. Mitosis takes one cell and makes two. How are the two related to the one they came from? Exactly the same. Eventually, that process of mitosis creates spores that germinate and we start over. Over here, though, this is the sexual part over here. You have mycelia or hyphae from two different fungi. Usually we call them plus and minus mating strands. They grow together, they fuse. The fusion of the cell or the cytoplasm of the cell is called plasmogamy. That creates a cell that has what? One cell with what? Two nuclei, dikaryotic, two nuclei. Eventually, those two nuclei fuse together. That's called karyogamy, fusion of the nuclei. That's a lot like what that happens in people. Well, be a little bit more exact there. fusion of two haploid nuclei. That is like what? No. When do haploid nuclei fuse in people? Come on, guys. Fertilization. Sperm plus egg. Haploid sperm plus haploid egg.
That's it.
Yeah, I was trying to tell you to get a little bit more exact. Haploid plus haploid gives you diploid, and in that case, a diploid what? What is the first cell that you came from called? Zygote. A diploid zygote. That cell that's formed, that diploid cell that's formed in a fungus, goes through meiosis. Meiosis takes one cell and creates how many? Meiosis takes one and creates four. It splits it twice. And those four cells that are made are, first of all, haploid. And are they just like each other? They're different. They're not just like each other. They're not just like the cell they came from. That's the purpose of this whole process. To create what? Variation. So that they're able to what? Evolve, adapt, change. Anyway, once meiosis happens, usually the four cells that are made then undergo what? Mitosis. So usually we end up with not four, but 8, because they all split again. And those 8 cells grow up to be spores, and they fly out into the air or land on a piece of food or something. They grow, they germinate, and it all starts over again. That's the general life cycle of fungi in general. Pretty much all the groups work this way. Here's mushroom. Now, the next group, the ascomycetes, sac fungi. Their reproductive structure looks sort of like a sac. These are some pretty common things like truffles, penicillium, yeast. Both of these next two names, this is like the yeast that causes yeast infections. This is the yeast that's used to make like wine and beer and stuff like that. They're scientific names. Their reproductive structures are called an ascus or asci. There are truffles. So those cost hundreds of dollars a pound. Look like dog poop. Yummy.
They're only better than rice.
Yeah, so there are some yeasts which are single-celled fungi. And here's their life cycle, which you're going to see is remarkably like what we just talked about. Two hyphae fused together from different mating strands. That's plasmogamy. Those create cells like these right in here, which have two haploid nuclei. They're dikaryotic. Eventually, those two nuclei will fuse, and we'll get one diploid cell like we did there. That one diploid cell will undergo meiosis, and it will form 4 haploid cells like we got there that are different from each other. Those 4 undergo meiosis. 4 become 8. Notice they're in a sac. That's why these are called ascomycetes, sac-like fungus. Those 8 cells grow up to be spores, which will burst out of those sacs, land on the ground, land on something, germinate, and it all starts over again. Remembering that also they're probably going through an asexual part of their life cycle as well, which we see over there. This is all about mitosis. This is all about meiosis. Make sense? All right, the zygomycetes are like bread molds. Sometimes they're called terrestrial fungi. They cause a lot of diseases. There are a lot of human fungal diseases, and that's one of the things we're going to concentrate on today, are some of those. There's just some regular old bread mold. Remember, when you're seeing bread mold, you're mostly seeing what? The spores. Most of the fungus is actually in the bread, in the food. You can't see it. So here's their reproductive cycle, remarkably similar to all the others we talked about. 2 hyphae from different mating types fused together. That's plasmogamy. Creates dikaryotic, or here they Here they use the word heterokaryotic, which means what? What's hetero mean? Different nuclei. Two different nuclei in this case. They fuse together through karyogamy, create a diploid cell. That goes through meiosis, creates haploid spores. Those germinate, disperse, and start all over again. But notice again, it also has an asexual thing going on too. The imperfect fungi, deuteromycetes, they're put in this group because scientists don't really know much about them usually. They can't figure out how they do what? Exactly how they reproduce. They probably know how they reproduce asexually, but they either don't have a sexual part of their life cycle, or they just haven't been able to figure it out yet. Scientists haven't. A lot of things that were originally put in this group have been taken out because eventually they did figure it out. Like Candida, yeast, they figured out how they reproduced sexually, and now they're in the appropriate group. Same with penicillium. All right, there's some edible fungi, different kinds of mushrooms. We talked a little bit about the symbiosis stuff the other day. For some reason, the AP people like to ask about this kind of stuff. That first word, mycorrhiza. We know from me saying this over and over again today that myco means fungus, and rhiza means root. Fungus root is what that word really means. It's a mutualistic association between tree roots and fungi. So it's fungi growing on tree roots. What do they increase about the tree root? Physically, what do they increase? Surface area. And more surface area means the root's better able to what? Absorb stuff. Now it turns out that a lot of trees can't live without this thing. If you spray tree roots before you plant the tree with like an antifungal drug, the tree usually dies. It's necessary for a lot of trees to have this. You can't live without it. Lichens, we saw pictures of last time, and you've all seen lichens growing on the sides of trees. Little paper-like bluish-green things. They're a mutualistic relationship between fungi and cyanobacteria. If you were in class yesterday, cyanobacteria are bacteria that can what? Photosynthesize. So they provide food, and what does the fungus provide for them? They're living inside the fungus. What's the fungus providing them? Shelter. It's a good thing for both. The succession stuff we'll talk about later. There's a lichen. You've all seen those things before, growing on trees. Part bacteria, part fungus. Now I know this is hard to read. It's even hard for me to read. I think I'm going to change the font real quick. Maybe. There we go. Whoops. Not sure what I just did there. Okay, maybe this will be a little bit easier to read. All right, these are different diseases caused by fungi. There's one called the fungus name is Aspergillus. We need to know these. I wouldn't be going over them if you didn't. Okay. And the actual disease, aspergillosis. And you probably all had this before. This can cause allergies. How many fungal spores are in the air in this room right now? A whole bunch. And you're probably going to run into ones that you're allergic to occasionally. Might be these. They can cause sinus infections. What are your sinuses, by the way? What are your sinuses? What are they physically? What are they? You've all heard about sinus infections, but I'm gonna bet that half of you don't know what they are. They're cavities in your skull. They're holes in your skull. That's what your sinuses are. And sometimes things start to grow in those holes in your skull. Sometimes it's bacteria, sometimes it's fungi. They also can cause ear infections and even infections of your lungs. Where do fungi like to grow? Give me 3 characteristics of places fungi like to grow. Dark, moist, warm. Your sinuses fit all 3 of those. Your ears fit all 3 of those. Tell you something really gross. When I was a kid, we had a swimming pool at home, and I swam just about every day. I was a pretty good swimmer back in the day. And I like to swim underwater. So I would spend hours every day underwater swimming. When I was probably, I don't know, maybe 10th grade, I started having this really bad ear infection. I mean, it hurt all the time. So I went to the, first of all, I went to the regular doctor, and he gave me some antibiotics, and that didn't do any good. It just kept getting worse. So eventually I started like poking around on my ear like this, and I could hear something in there rattling. So I continued to just do this number and just pop it, and eventually this stuff started coming out, it looked like paper. Pieces of paper almost coming out of my ear. I'm putting paper in my ear. So I kept messing with it, and just this big wads of this like paper stuff kept coming out day after day after day after day after day. And I didn't know what it was because I was just like a 10th grader. Eventually I go to the ear doctor and he tells me I have a fungal infection in my ear. And he takes this thing that looks like one of those syringes that like you put like decorations on your cake with, you know, those little squirt things. And he fills it up with like warm water and just sprays it into my ear. And as he does, it like starts leaking out. It's wads of this paper-like stuff are coming out. It takes me like 6 months to get rid of this ear infection. Why is our fungal infection so hard to get rid of? Their cells are almost just like what? Ours. And if you use a medicine that will kill a fungal infection, there's a good chance it's going to hurt some of your cells too. Really hard to get rid of them. And I'm going to bet some of you had some of these infections we're about to talk about. They're hard to get rid of. Candida albicans is the one that causes yeast infections. Realize they're not just in a woman's reproductive area. Also in the throat you can get yeast infections, and that's called thrush. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. That's not a pretty thing. There's another fungus with a weird name, Claviceps purpurea. I think we mentioned this one the other day. This is the one that sometimes called ergot, E-R-G-O-T, ergot. It grows on grain, particularly rye, and it makes a chemical almost chemically identical to what? LSD. And that a lot of people think that the Salem witch trials happened because people in that area were eating a lot of rye. And in that time frame, it was really wet in New England, which means what happened with this fungus on the grain? It's really wet. What's the fungus going to do? It's going to grow all over the place. And when they ground up the rye to make bread, they ground up the fungus too. So they were eating LSD basically. And probably a lot of those crazy things you read about in the Crucible and stuff like that, they really were seeing those things. Because they were having LSD trips basically. So it's crazy stuff. There are a lot of fungal diseases that also affect plants. You see these little shelf-like things growing out of the sides of trees. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? They're called shelf fungi. Most of that fungus is actually living where, though? In the tree, feeding off what? What's like the blood system of the tree? The xylem and the phloem. It's like feeding off that. It's growing into the phloem, which is the sugar carrying part, right? And eventually it can back that up, block it, and just kill the tree. So when you see all these shelves sticking out of a tree, realize that tree's sick. It's infected. It's got a fungus infection, and it's probably going to kill it.
You cut it off and be all right.
Well, you can cut that outside part off, but remember, most of it's actually inside. It's just going to pop out another one. Cut it off. So there's a disease. You don't need to know so much the scientific names of these, but two diseases that are pretty common in the United States: Dutch elm disease and chestnut blight. Those two fungi have killed most of the trees that they're named after. So those tree species are very rare now because these fungi have killed them off. Dutch elms and chestnut trees, very rare. Again, these next couple, you don't really need to know the scientific names, but Trichophyton tuncerans, I may be saying that wrong. That's caused a ringworm. Confess up. How many of you have had ringworm before? A few. Ringworm has nothing to do with worms. It's a fungal infection. It's called a worm infection because it's raised, right? It sort of looks like you got a worm under your skin. You don't. It's a fungal infection. It's also very easy to catch from somebody. Pretty much all you have to do is touch something that person has touched. Because what? How's it transmitted? Spores. That thing's putting out spores all over the place. This is very easy to catch. Athlete's foot is very similar. How do you get athlete's foot? Why is it called athlete's foot in the first place? It is terrible. I've had it before too. A lot of athletes get it because they're in locker rooms. And if you're a guy and you've ever been in a guy's locker room, tend to be kind of nasty places. Football coaches are not real cleanly most of the time. And a lot of times they shower, and so it's wet and it's hot. It's not very well lit. And these fungi start to grow and they're all over the floor. Well, if you get a shower in the locker room and you walk out, what do you step on? It's fungus spores. And they get in your feet and start to grow. Yeah.
Is there other ways to get it? Because, like, my dad, he had it not too long ago, and he can get it.
Yeah, I mean, you can pick it up from just the floor of your house. But typically you pick it up from stepping where those spores are at somewhere. Makes your feet swell, itch. It's almost like they're dripping. Start giving out watery stuff. It's nasty. Nasty. Very hard to get rid of, too. I think I had that for like 2 or 3 weeks. It's terrible. Terrible to get rid of. Now, a couple other fungi that I'll mention, and again, the scientific names are not so important, but there's a lot of poisonous mushrooms, right? One of the most poisonous ones called a manatee. You don't want to eat one of those. It'll kill you. But most of the basidiomycetes, they're not really dangerous to people other than if you eat them. But they do cause a lot of plant diseases, like that corn smut that we saw a picture of a minute ago. Wheat rust. Realize that wheat rust, the only thing it has to do with rust is what? Why is it called wheat rust? It looks sort of like rust. Has nothing to do with rust, other than the fact that it looks like it. It's a fungus infection of a plant. Now I've got a few pictures of some of this stuff I want to show you. Let's turn off the lights so we can see a little better. That's a ringworm infection. So you can see why some people might think it's a worm. It's not. It's just a fungus infection. Now this is thrush. This is the little hangy down thing in the back of your throat. What's that called? The uvula. So that all that mucusy like stuff, that's actually yeast growing in this person's throat.
Could you extract it and make alcohol?
Different fungus. I mean, you would make something. I don't know if it'd make ethanol or not, though. It's a different yeast than we use to make alcohol. What's this right here? That's somebody spilling in their teeth. So it pretty much the whole tooth is filled. Yep. All right, there's mycorrhiza, and remember, those are fungi growing on the roots of trees. All right, I'm not going to say much more about fungi other than the fact this thing, Sordaria, we actually have a lab we're going to do with this fungus, and that's why I bring it up later. And I'll show you its life cycle. This is the Sordaria we're going to use. Same life cycle we talked about over and over again. The two hyphae from two different fungi grow together. When they fuse, we call that fusion of the cells or cytoplasm, we call plasmogamy. That creates this one cell with two nuclei, which we call dikaryotic. The two haploid nuclei fuse, we call that karyogamy. And then that diploid cell that's formed, that zygote, goes through meiosis. One cell makes four haploids that are different from each other. Those undergo mitosis, so 4 become 8. These are ascomycetes, so they're in a little sac. Those grow up to be spores, sexually created spores, which will burst out, land on some kind of substrate, some kind of food, sprout, grow, do mitosis, and start all over again. And that's generally how fungi work. And that's as far as we're going to go with fungi today. We're going to switch over and talk about animals a little bit.
We're still going to talk more about fungi?
No, we're done with fungi. That's it. Now back to this phylogenetic tree. Here are animals. Here are some characteristics of animal cells. Obviously, animal cells are all eukaryotic. True nucleus, membrane-bound organelles. All animals are multicellular. All animals are heterotrophic. These first three characteristics are just like fungi, right? Now where we're a little bit different, we don't have any cell walls. Our animal cells don't have cell walls. Either the cells or the organism are motile. And that means what? Right, can move. And one other difference between us and fungi is that our cells are usually diploid. We usually have what? 2 sets of chromosomes, one from each parent. And that's good because that protects us from what? Yeah, recessive mutations. It's like we have a backup copy. And it keeps us from getting a lot of things that if we only had one set of chromosomes, we would get. Now us guys are a little bit different than you ladies, in that there's one chromosome, one set of chromosomes that we're haploid in. And that set of chromosomes is which one? Well, what do we call it? X and Y. Those are what kind of chromosomes? X and Y are the sex chromosomes. We have only one of each. So if we get either one of those with a mutation on it, what does that mean about us as guys? We're mutated. We're out of luck. Ladies, on the other hand, you have 2 X's, right? You're diploid for every chromosome. You've got protection for every kind of chromosome. Us guys do, except for the sex chromosomes. And that's why there's some weird genetic diseases that guys get that women don't. And when we get to genetics, we'll talk about some of those. All right, I know there's a lot of writing on this slide. Don't try to write it all down. If the PowerPoint's posted, you can get the PowerPoint. First of all, that first word, metazoan. Anybody have any idea what that might mean? I mean, it's got zoa in it. What's zoa mean? Z-O-A. What does protozoa mean? Proto means first, and zoa means zoo. Yeah, it's like zoo. Animal. Okay? Now realize protozoans are not the first animals, but they're the first animal-like things. Metazoans are animals that have tissues, true tissues. Animals with true tissues. And this is talking about how they develop as embryos. How do we start with egg and sperm and end up with a baby? And there's 4 main steps in embryonic development. This slide, if you had known this slide last year and you were taking this class, it's basically an essay question about this slide last year, one of the pre-response questions. First thing that happens, we just talked about a minute ago, fertilization. Haploid sperm and haploid egg get together. They fuse. Their nuclei fuse. And we end up with a cell, a diploid cell called what? Haploid plus haploid gives you diploid zygote. That cell goes through very rapid cell division. What kind of cell division? What are we trying to do here? Just trying to make new cells. So what kind of cell division is in charge of just making new cells? Mitosis. It does mitosis really, really fast. No. I'm still here in the first. So that one cell very quickly undergoes mitosis and you end up with a ball of cells. All genetically what? Just alike. It's mitosis. Mitosis just copies things. Also during this period, let me turn the lights back up. Those cells start to organize themselves a little bit. And it says here that 3 embryonic axes are established. What's anterior and posterior mean? Front and back. Anterior is front, posterior is back. This is easier to think about with a 4-legged animal. If you're thinking about a dog, the anterior would be what part of the dog? The head side. Posterior would be the tail side. All right, so that's one axis, front to back. Dorsal and ventral. Top and bottom, if you're talking about a 4-legged thing, think about the dorsal fin in a shark, right? It's on the back. So it's like the top of a 4-legged animal. Ventral is like the belly. And then, obviously, left and right. So the cells start to organize themselves on these 3 planes. All right, after fertilization, step 2 is called cleavage. What does cleave mean? Cleave means to cut or split. Cut or split. So the cell, it says the first egg divides into progressively smaller cells with no net growth of the embryo. So you start off with one fairly large cell. And it just splits so fast before it has any time to what? What's that say over there? It splits so fast before it has any time to grow. So the embryo doesn't really change size any, it's got a lot of different divisions in it now, a lot of different cells. You end up in this step with a solid ball of cells called the morula. So that's the first ball of cells formed after fertilization. The egg and sperm make the zygote. The zygote splits very quickly until you've got this solid ball of cells called the morula. The cells in this ball secrete this thick liquid. And that kind of pushes the cells aside so that you end up with a cavity in the middle, like a hole. what's that hole going to become? It's going to become your digestive tract, GI tract. So this ball of cells forms. First it's solid. When it's a solid ball of cells, it's called a morula. These cells make this thick liquid that basically pushes the hole down the middle. Once that tube is formed in the middle, and now you've got a hollow ball of cells, it's called the blastula. So when it's solid, it's called the morula. Once it hollows out and you've got this tube going through the middle, it's called a blastula. All right, step 3 is called gastrulation. And this is where it starts to get maybe a little bit complicated. The cells in here move around, in this ball of cells, move around, and they organize themselves into 3 distinct layers of cells. 3 important layers, called the germ layers. And these germ layers have names that should be, I hope, pretty obvious to you. The outer layer is called ectoderm. What does that word literally mean? Ectoderm. Ecto means outside. Derm means skin, outer skin. Mesoderm is the middle one. Meso means middle skin. And the very innermost layer of this thing, and I'll show you a picture so you understand this better in a minute. But the very innermost layer of this embryo is called the endoderm. These germ layers are what we might call your stem cells. What are stem cells? They're cells that haven't decided what they want to be when they grow up yet. Which means they have the ability to do what? To become anything. But depending on which layer they're in, they're going to become certain things. Like the ectoderm is going to make one set of stuff. The mesoderm is going to make a different set of stuff. And the endoderm is going to make a different set of stuff. And we'll look at those things that it's called later. But once it gets into these 3 distinct germ layers, this ball of cells is now called a gastrula. So we've named it 3 different things. When it's just a solid ball of cells, it's called a morula. Once it's cleared a tube down the middle and it's hollowed itself out, the ball of cells is called the blastula. Then, once the cells organize themselves into these 3 distinct layers of cells, it's called the gastrula. And I'll end with this last one here. Organogenesis is step 4. That word should be pretty self-explanatory. What's Genesis mean? Doesn't mean beginning. Doesn't mean first. It means creation. Creation of organs. Okay? This is when the organs are made. These germ layers are in charge. Each germ layer is in charge of making different parts of your body. Obviously, the endoderm is probably going to make what? It's the innermost part of you. It's going to make like your very internal organs. The ectoderm, on the other hand, is probably going to make what? The stuff on the outside of your body. That's your skin and your ears and things on the outside.
So metasomal and embryonic cell makes the whole making of digestive tract.
It's the whole making of everything. It's the making of an organism, of a baby. And we'll get through more of that in more detail later. But I think that's a good place to stop.